right, old school NBA fans, or should I say NFL fans, self-researched NBA facts. Got another video for you. As always, thanks to anybody who watches my videos, subscribes to my channel. I really appreciate it. This is a very special video, one that I was looking forward to doing. 50 years ago today, Walter Payton made his NFL debut. My childhood idol, a guy I've idolized ever since, whose death definitely shook me to my core. I looked up to this guy like no other. He was a great man, a great football player, and in my opinion, the greatest running back who ever played. I got the luxury of watching every one of Walter Payton's games from probably 1978 on. I was just too young to understand his first 3 seasons, I guess you could say. Of course, that 1977 season, still one of the best ever by a running back. Some of my most prized possessions that I have. Walter Payton rookie card right here. My autographed Walter Payton picture right here. The man was an absolute legend, and he still doesn't get the credit he deserves. And there's a lot of people that just don't understand the impact too. We were just talking about Walter Payton in the live chat last weekend, Angry Old Hoops. Sports and Fitness Rants is still convinced that Jim Brown's the greatest running back. People say Barry Sanders is. There's been a lot of great running backs over the years, no doubt. But there's really just 3 names who have any kind of a claim to the greatest. Jim Brown, Barry Sanders, and Walter Payton. It's definitely got to be those 3, 1, 2, and 3. O.J. Simpson is probably 4th. Marshall Faulk, Adrian Peterson, LaDainian Tomlinson, Earl Campbell. There's been a lot of great running backs over the years, no doubt about it. Even if you want to go really old school, Red Grange, Bronco Nagurski, Gale Sayers, there's been a lot of them. But those are the 3 that most people consider to be the best 3 of all time. But I'm going to lay out my case as to why Walter Payton is the greatest running back of all time, and maybe the best football player who ever lived. Now, I like to think that I have a unique perspective on Walter Payton's career because I saw 100% of the games he played from 1978 through 87, his last 10 seasons. I also got to see about half of Barry Sanders' career as well. Jim Brown, obviously, all we have is the old clips. Now, I'm going to compare the 3 running backs. Not as most people do, like I've seen in this stupid way. They just straight up say, oh, who had more yards a carry or yards a game and stuff like that. Well, if only it were that simple. Because Barry Sanders and Jim Brown had way better offensive players to play with. Walter Payton just didn't. He didn't have the luxury of having a great offensive line like an Emmitt Smith did or Jim Brown did. He had a bunch of bums. Not much different than how Michael Jordan was. And that's another thing too. I don't think people outside of Illinois understand. If you were to ask an average sports fan in Illinois, you ask them, who is the more beloved athlete in Illinois? Michael Jordan or Walter Payton? It'll be 4-1, Walter Payton, all the way, no doubt about it. All right, so let's start with this right here. Wide receivers. Obviously, if you have a good receiver, that's going to take pressure off of the defense keying on you all the time, which is what Payton had to deal with 8- and 9-man boxes his first 10 years of his career. The Bears' top wide receiver in yards. These numbers are pitiful, but here you go. In 1975, Bo Rather, anybody ever heard of him? I haven't even heard of him. 685 yards with 2 TDs. James Scott in 76. 512 yards. James Scott in 77, 809. James Scott in 78, 759. Brian Bashnagel had 452 in 1979. James Scott in 1980 was 696. Ken Marjoram, 1981, 584 yards. He only had 1 touchdown. Ricky Watts, 1982. 217 yards. Now, that was a strike-shortened year. They only had 9 games that year. But still, 217 yards, that's it. Willie Gault, when he came to the team, finally, the Bears had a deep threat down the field. But even still, he was not elite. Willie Gault in 83 through 87 had 836, 587, 704, 818, and 705. He did have an 8 touchdown, a 6, a 5, and a 7 touchdown season. That's as good as it got for Walter Payton. He just never had another receiver to take the pressure off of himself running the ball. It never happened. And it's also important to note the first 3 years of Walter Payton's career that it was a 14-game schedule. Then it became a 16-game schedule. What was Barry Sanders dealing with? Well, his rookie year, 1989. Richard Johnson, 70 catches for 1,091 yards. Both those were better than anything Walter Payton ever had. 8 touchdowns. That ties the most that Walter Payton receiver ever had. Robert Clark in 89, 748, and then in 1990 had 914 yards. That's also more than Payton ever had. Richard Johnson in 1990, 727. Brett Perryman in 91, 668. Herman Moore, when he came in, that really changed everything for the Lions, opening up the offense. In 92, Herman Moore had 966 yards. Also in the same season in 1992, Brett Perryman had 810. So the number 2 receiver is better than any receiver Payton had, basically. In 93, Herman Moore, 935 yards with 6 touchdowns. In 94, Herman Moore, 1,173 yards with 11 touchdowns. Brett Perryman the same year, 761 yards. In 1995, get this, Herman Moore, 1,686 yards with 14 touchdowns. Brett Perryman, the same season, 108 catches for 1,488 yards and 9 touchdowns. Must be nice. 1996, Herman Moore, 106 catches, 1,296 and 9 touchdowns. Brett Perryman in the same season, 94 catches, 1,021 yards and 5 touchdowns. 97, Herman Moore goes for 104 for 1,293 and 8 touchdowns. In the same year, Johnny Morton, 80 catches, 1,057 yards, 6 touchdowns. 98, Johnny Morton, 69 catches, 1,028 yards. Herman Moore, 983 yards, 5 touchdowns. So all told, Barry Sanders had 9 1,000-yard receivers. That must be incredible. I mean, the contrast is unbelievable. Barry Sanders had way more weapons than Walter Payton did. Jim Brown's tenure. His rookie year, 57. Pete Brewster, 614 yards. 58, Ray Renfro, 573 with 6 touchdowns. And 59, Ray Renfro, 528 with 6 touchdowns. It looks similar to Payton, but they were getting more touchdowns. Jern Nagler, 1960, 616 yards. Ray Renfro in 61, 834 yards. Rick Kreitling, 1962 at 659. Gary Collins in 1963 at 674 yards with 13 touchdowns. Way more than Walter Payton ever had. Paul Warfield, a Hall of Fame wide receiver in 1964, 920 yards, 9 touchdowns. And that's in 14 games. And then in 1965, Jim Brown's last year, Gary Collins, 884 yards with 10 touchdowns. So I think it's fair to say that Jim Brown had a little bit better receiving help than Walter Payton did, and Barry Sanders had way better receiving help than Walter Payton did. Now let's take a look at the quarterbacks. Jim Brown's quarterback, 1957, Tommy O'Connell. Yards aren't high, but they did rush a lot more back then. 9 touchdowns with 8 picks. That's the most important thing here. Milt Plum, from 58 to 1961, actually a pretty good quarterback. He had 11 touchdowns, 11 picks, 14 touchdowns, 8 picks, 21 touchdowns, only 5 picks, 18 touchdowns, and 10 picks. Jim Nanowski in 1962 had 7 touchdowns with 8 picks. Frank Ryan, another guy, he's getting 2,000 yards like crazy. Milt Plum had 2 2,000-yard seasons. Frank Ryan, 2,026 yards, 25 touchdowns, 13 picks. 2404, 25 touchdowns, 19 picks. And then Jim Brown's last year in 65, Frank Ryan, 18 touchdowns, 13 picks. All told, in Jim Brown's 9 years from his quarterback, he got 1,912 yards, 148 touchdowns to 95 picks. On average, that's 1,879 a year, 16 and a half touchdowns to 11 and a half picks. Now, by today's passing standards, that's not very good. Back then, that's actually really good. How about Barry Sanders? Now, he had Rodney Peete early first half of his career. He was not really that good at all. But he was at least as good, if not better, than anything Walter Payton ever had. Rodney Peete went 5 touchdowns, 9 picks, 13 touchdowns, 8 picks, 5 touchdowns, 9 picks, 9 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, and then finally 6 touchdowns and 14 interceptions. Overall, that's not very good. Okay. Scott Mitchell comes in, 10 touchdowns, 11 picks, then 32 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Unbelievable season. Then he goes 17 touchdowns, 17 picks, 19 touchdowns, 14 picks, and then Charlie Batch was Barry Sanders last year, 11 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. All told, Barry Sanders quarterbacks, 22,537 yards, 129 touchdowns, 109 interceptions. Still more touchdowns than picks, right? On average, per season, that's 2,253 yards, 13 touchdowns to 11 interceptions. That's not really that great. Jim Brown's quarterback situation was a little bit better than Barry Sanders, no question. But Walter Payton's quarterbacks, you're not even going to believe this. 1975, Gary Huff, 3 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Bob Avellini from 76 through 78, 8 touchdowns, 15 interceptions. 11 touchdowns, 18 interceptions. 5 touchdowns, 16 interceptions. Mike Phipps, 1979, 9 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. Wow, that must feel like having Joe Montana. Vince Evans, in 1980, 11 touchdowns, 16 interceptions. In 81, he threw 11 touchdowns, 20 interceptions. Then they get Jim McMahon, who everybody acts like this dude is Steve Young or something. He was a solid game manager, but he was not some elite quarterback at all. But he was serviceable. He was decent. Jim McMahon's first year, 1982, 9 touchdowns, 7 picks. Not bad. That's the best TD to interception ratio we've seen yet. That's the first half of Payton's career. 1983, Jim McMahon, 12 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. 84, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. 85, 15 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. Then he gets hurt in 86. Despite the McMahon injury, they go 14-2. Mike Tomczak throws 2 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. What a bum! And then Jim McMahon and Walter Payton's last year, who he only played half the year because he was sharing the running back load with Neil Anderson. Walter Payton was 34 years old. He was on his way out, but he was trying to mentor Neil Anderson. Jim McMahon had 12 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. All told, 22,280 yards over Payton's 13 years, but really it's 10 full seasons and 3 half seasons. 75, he was just as much a kick returner as he was a running back. He wasn't the main guy yet. They didn't hand the keys over to him as a rookie. His last year when he was sharing running back duties with Neil Anderson, and then the strike shortened year. So really Payton played 11 and a half years, but technically it was stretched across 13 seasons. Sure. On average, Walter Payton's quarterbacks, 1,713 yards, 8.76 touchdowns to 11.77 interceptions. That is so terrible. I don't even know if you can find anybody who had to deal with something like that. But when you compare the 3 of them together, here you go. On average, Walter Payton quarterback, 1,713 yards. Barry Sanders quarterback was getting 2,253, so about 500 more per year. Jim Brown, in a 14-game schedule, was getting 1,879. That's about 150, 160 more per season than Walter Payton was getting. Now, how about touchdowns? A Walter Payton quarterback was getting 8.76 touchdowns a season. That's about half a game. Barry Sanders was getting 13 a year, and Jim Brown was getting 16 and a half per year. Interceptions, Jim Brown quarterbacks throwing 11 and a half interceptions a year. Barry Sanders, 10.9, a little bit better. Walter Payton, 11.77. So Walter Payton had the worst receiving core of the 3 running backs. He clearly had the worst quarterbacks of the three guys, no doubt about it. Walter Payton had such garbage on his team, yet he did what he did. If he would have had an Emmitt Smith offensive line, this is the most telling part of all, right here. How many offensive Pro Bowlers did each one of these running backs have? Let's take a look. Now, I understand there wasn't as many teams in the NFL back then, but there was an AFL, which is essentially the same thing as AFC and NFC. I think there was 20 total teams. When Walter Payton was there, it was like 26 teams, I believe. Barry Sanders, I think it was 28 or 30. I could be wrong about that, but it's not really that much. But sure, maybe because there's a few less teams, there might be more Pro Bowlers on your team because there's less teams. Okay, we can factor that in. Sure, no problem. In Jim Brown's career, his rookie year, he wins the MVP in 1957. I think it's important to note also, though, the Browns won the championship 2 of the 3 seasons before Jim Brown even got there. But here we go. Jim Brown in 1957. Pro Bowlers, Tommy O'Connell at quarterback, Ray Renfro at receiver, Lou Graza at left tackle, Mike McCormick right tackle. 1958, Jim Brown wins the MVP, 1,500 yards. Great job. He's got Lou Graza, a Hall of Fame left tackle, and Jim Ray Smith, left guard, was a Pro Bowler. He was like a 6 or 7 time Pro Bowler. 1959, Lou Graza and Jim Ray Smith again. In 1960, look at this cast of Pro Bowlers that Jim Brown had. Milt Plum at quarterback, Bobby Mitchell, running back. He had a Pro Bowl running back mate. Ray Renfro, wide receiver, Jim Ray Smith at left guard, and Mike McCormick at right tackle. And Mike McCormick is in the Hall of Fame, FYI. Oh, it doesn't stop there. 1961, Milt Plum at quarterback, Jim Ray Smith left guard, John Morrow at center, Mike McCormick right tackle. In 1962, Jim Ray Smith, Mike McCormick. 63, John Morrow, Dick Sherritt at left tackle. So you lose Lou Graza, you slide in another Pro Bowler right there at left tackle. Must be nice. And also Paul Warfield, Hall of Fame wide receiver. Unbelievable. And then in Jim Brown's last season, Frank Ryan at quarterback, Gary Collins at wide receiver, Dick Sherritt at left tackle, John Wooten at left guard, and Gene Hickerson at right guard. What a joke! Gene Hickerson is in the Hall of Fame. And just something to note also about Jim Brown. Everybody just goes right to Jim Brown. Oh, he's the greatest. It's Jim Brown. Well, Jim Brown was obviously a great running back. He's top 3. No question. These 3 are the 3. But you tell me if this carries any weight. In Jim Brown's last 2 seasons, 1964, he averaged 5.2 yards per carry. And then in his last season, 1965, 5.3 yards per carry. That's great, right? Okay. So after Jim Brown retired in 1965, he wanted to do movies or whatever it was. They got a guy named Leroy Kelly. He comes in 1966. He averages 5.5 yards per carry. He's got 1,100 and some yards. 1967, 5.1 yards per carry. He leads the NFL in rushing. 1968, 5 yards per carry. Leads the NFL in rushing. So what I'm saying is, the Browns had a great offensive line and a very good offense in general that a guy named Leroy Kelly could fill Jim Brown's shoes. Not entirely. No, he was not as good as Jim Brown. Not making that case. But Leroy Kelly's in the Hall of Fame. Then he suffered some injuries and they went to more of a committee thing or whatever. But still, the fact remains that the Browns filled Jim Brown very neatly. And yes, at the end of Walter Payton's career, Neil Anderson came in. He had a couple 1,000-yard seasons as well. He did a pretty good job. He really did. But that was at the end when Walter Payton had Jimbo Covert and Tom Thayer and Jay Hilgenberg. He had good offensive linemen, but only at the tail end of Payton's career. All told, in Jim Brown's 9 seasons, he had 29 offensive Pro Bowlers. That's more than 3 per season. So you're one of the offensive players. That means 3 other guys are Pro Bowlers. 4 of the 11 guys on offense are Pro Bowlers on average. And even 2 additional seasons, there's 5 guys Pro Bowlers on offense. Unbelievable. Barry Sanders, his rookie year, 1989, he did not have an offensive Pro Bowler. In 1990, Lomas Brown, left tackle. And I've heard people make the case that, well, Lomas Brown, he didn't do anything until Barry got there, so Barry made him a Pro Bowler. Then how did Lomas Brown make Pro Bowl on the Arizona Cardinals after he left Detroit? Reputation, right? No, he was a very good tackle. In 91, Lomas Brown. In 92, Lomas Brown. In 93, Lomas Brown. In 1994, it's Lomas Brown and Herman Moore. In 95, Lomas Brown, Herman Moore, and now center Kevin Glover. In 96, Herman Moore, Kevin Glover. In 97, Herman Moore, Kevin Glover. In 98, he had none. So 2 years for Barry out of 10, he had no Pro Bowlers, his rookie and his last season. The 8 in between, he had 13 Pro Bowlers. On average, Barry Sanders had 1.3 offensive Pro Bowlers per season. Now that's not a ton, but wait till you see Walter Payton. Walter Payton, Bears Pro Bowlers. Here we go. His rookie year in 1975, none. 76, none. You can see for yourself. His first 10 seasons, no offensive Pro Bowlers. None. So when you went to play the Bears on Sunday, what were you keying on? A guy who throws 8 touchdowns and 16 interceptions? You're probably going to pressure him, sure. You're going to key on Walter Payton. We stop Payton, we beat the Bears. That 1977 season that Payton had, as you can see, 1,852 yards rushing. That was in 14 games. That would have easily been the equivalent of a 2,000-yard season. He willed that team to a 9-5 record and got them in the playoffs. A pitiful team. The only Pro Bowlers he had at all before the 80s that made the Pro Bowl was Wally Chambers. He was like a corner. 1985, finally, Walter Payton gets a line. But I want you to note, before that, 1983, at age 30, when finally some of these better guys are starting to trickle in. At age 30, Walter Payton rushed for 1,421 yards. That's pretty good for a 30-year-old. At 31 years old, 1,684 yards. That's very impressive. In 1985, at 32, 1,551, and they won the Super Bowl with a 15-1 record. If you count the playoffs, Walter Payton and the Bears went on a stretch from the 1985 season all the way through the playoffs and the entire 1986 regular season. They won 32 out of 35 games. I guarantee you Jim Brown or Barry Sanders never won 32 out of 35 games. Guarantee it. 1986, Payton is obviously on the decline, but even still, 1,333 yards. And also in 85, Payton was 32. He had 2,000 all-purpose yards, 32 years old. That's very impressive. But yes, in 85, he finally got Pro Bowlers, Jim McMahon, Jimbo Covert, and Jay Hilgenberg. Jimbo Covert just made the Hall of Fame about 5 years ago, about 40 years after he was playing with Walter Payton. And Jay Hilgenberg, I thought, was better than Covert. Maybe he'll get in eventually. And then in 86, it was just Jimbo Covert and Hilgenberg. And then in 87, just Hilgenberg. All told, in Walter Payton's 13 years, 6 offensive Pro Bowlers. That's less than half a one per year. And it only happened his last 3 years. He went 10 seasons with no offensive Pro Bowlers. Please, you're telling me that doesn't matter? Since when was that? And longevity is always a piece of the argument. It's not the whole thing. Its peak is always going to be it. But when it comes to a running back, Jim Brown stopped at 29, Barry Sanders stopped at 30. That's fine. But even at age 30, Barry Sanders had 1,491 to Payton's 1,421. He had 70 more rushing yards. But receiving, Payton 607 to Barry Sanders 289. So Walter Payton had a 2,000-yard all-purpose season at age 30. Barry just didn't. But that's fine. Clearly, Walter Payton had the worst supporting cast of the 3 running backs by a mile. Barry Sanders is in the middle. He had a few years of Scott Mitchell that opened up the offense and Herman Moore and all that. But he had Lomas Brown and Kevin Glover pretty much his whole career. They were very good. Lomas Brown is in the Hall of Fame. Kevin Glover was a 3 or 4 time Pro Bowler, very good center. On defense, they had Benny Blades, Chris Spielman, Jerry Ball. Those guys are making Pro Bowls. Walter Payton did have some pretty good defensive players, some great ones at the end of his career, but that's defense. And I don't know if it matters at all, but you know how everybody beats up Michael Jordan about, oh, the expansion era. Does it mean anything that there was an expansion in the NFL in 1995? Carolina Panthers and Jacksonville Jaguars? Does that water down Barry Sanders? See? Don't have it both ways now. The fact is that Jim Brown played with Hall of Fame linemen Lou Graza, Mike McCormick, Gene Hickerson. Jim Ray Smith's like a 7-time Pro Bowler. He had immense, great offensive lineman help. Ray Renfro, a very good receiver, made Pro Bowls. Paul Warfield, Hall of Fame wide receiver. I told you about Leroy Kelly. The Jim Brown goes away, they slide in their next Hall of Fame running back. All things considered, Walter Payton is the greatest running back of all time. If you want to talk about just running the ball, Jim Brown and Barry Sanders are probably a little better than Payton. Barry Sanders was more elusive. Brown and Sanders were both faster than Walter Payton was. Even though Payton was elusive, he used the stiff arm, the forearm, the shoulder, a lot more than these other guys did. They had good breakaway speed. Jim Brown getting the open field, he's like the biggest guy in the field and the fastest. Walter wasn't the fastest. But all things considered, all the duties of a running back, Walter Payton is the greatest running back of all time. He had the least worst supporting cast. He had garbage on his team. Until his last 3 seasons, they won a Super Bowl. They went 15-1 and 14-2. See what happens when you give Payton some players around him? Yeah, they're unstoppable. If Jim McMahon doesn't get hurt in 86, I think they repeat. Jim Brown's best receiving seasons ever, 517, 459 yards. He had 2 years over 400 yards. Barry Sanders, best 2 years, 480 and 398. Walter Payton has a 607, a 483, and a 480. To me, Walter Payton's the better receiver. Did you know Walter Payton, to this day, is the number 1 in Chicago Bears history in receptions? Yeah, number 1 for the Bears all time in receptions is Walter Payton. He's number 4 in receiving yards. This is a multi-purpose back. Walter Payton was the best of these 3 at the goal line. He would just jump right over. Barry Sanders is likely to lose 3 yards. Jim Brown was pretty good at the goal line, but he wasn't Walter. Payton was the best of the 3 as a 4-down back. He was the best receiver of the 3. He was the best blocker of the 3. He might be the best football player ever. He could kick field goals. He did it in college. He's even got a punt on the books and was the backup punter. Walter Payton willed his team in 1977, 9-5 record, made the playoffs. And then in 1980, 10-6, made the playoffs. Their defense has definitely gotten better, but Walter Payton was their offense for the first decade of his career. How many 2,000-yard seasons did these guys have? Jim Brown has 1. He only had 14 games, but Payton only had 14 his first 3 seasons. But Jim Brown did have 4 years of 1,750, which would be pretty close to the equivalent of 2,000 in a 16 game. Barry Sanders only has 2 2,000-yard from scrimmage seasons. Walter Payton has 4. And again, Payton has 3 seasons where they were half seasons. So really, he played 10 full seasons. And he's got just as many as Jim Brown does, even if you do the equivalent of, and more than Barry Sanders. You want to talk passing? Jim Brown threw for 3 touchdown passes in his career. That's impressive. 39, 37, and 13-yard touchdown passes. Wow, that's really cool, right? Barry Sanders never has any of that. He doesn't. I think he completed 1 pass in his whole career, no touchdown, nothing like that. Walter Payton, 8 touchdown passes in his career, 1 in the playoffs to make it 9. He threw a 54-yard touchdown, a 39-yard touchdown, a 50-yard touchdown, a 42-yard touchdown, and a 56-yard touchdown in his career. Tell me that dude can't play quarterback. He had a game where he was 3 for 6, 95 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He had another game he was 3 for 8, 47 yards, 2 touchdowns, and another game where he was 3 for 5, 96 yards, and a touchdown. Yeah, that's Walter Payton. He could do anything. You want to talk about as a returner. All 3 of them were returners at one point or another. Barry Sanders in his career, punter kickoff, 5 for 118 yards, no touchdowns. His long was 43 yards. 21.9 yards per return. Jim Brown, 29 for 648, 22.3 yards per return. His long was 35. So he's about half a yard better than Barry Sanders, but Barry's long was a little bit better. Okay, great. Walter Payton was 17 for 539, 31.7 yards per return. And his longest was, I think it was like 65 yards, something like that. All-purpose touchdowns. Walter Payton has 110 rushing touchdowns, 15 receiving, 8 passing for 133. Barry Sanders has 99 rushing and 10 receiving for 109 all-purpose touchdowns. So you can use any criteria you want. You can look at it any way you want. But to me, it's Walter Payton all day. Now you're going to say, well, you're very biased. Yes, I am. But I also got to see Walter's whole career. So I'm telling you, this dude was the best all-around running back of all time. If you want to say running the ball, you want to say, well, Barry was better in the open field. He was better at shaking tacklers. I agree, he was. He was quicker than Walter Payton was. But when you want to consider blocking, the threat to pass the ball at the goal line, 4 down back as a receiver, he even led the team in tackles after a turnover because his quarterbacks would always be fumbling, throwing picks. Walter Payton was the one who went and tackled the other team when they were returning the ball. He was a better returner than the other two guys. He was just a better all-around player than Barry Sanders or Jim Brown was. You want to say they were better at running the ball and in the open field, fine. But they were not a better all-around running back. Better runners, yes. Better running back, no. They were not. And I could even put up an argument that Walter Payton is the greatest football player of all time. He could do anything on the field, anything. If you had to have 11 of the same player, who would it be? So obviously if you had 11 Tom Brady's, you'd get crushed when you were on defense, right? If you had 11 Lawrence Taylors, well, on defense, you'd be phenomenal. But on offense, I don't know, maybe. Could he throw the ball? How would he do? How would he do it blocking? How about Deion Sanders? I think he'd get crushed at the line. But I think if you had 11 Walter Paytons, I think you would beat 11 of any player that you can name. I'm going to close with this. I know this video is running long, but man, I'm so excited to do a Walter Payton video. Walter Payton started his career 50 years ago today. He had 8 carries for 0 yards. He was demoralized. I remember hearing about it, how demoralized he was. In game 2, he came right back with 21 carries for 95 yards. That's really nice. In game 4, Walter Payton had 10 carries for 0 yards. In game 10, 4 carries for 2 yards. His line was so terrible. It was almost impossible just to get to the line of scrimmage because the defenders were all over you. But in Walter Payton's last game of the season in his rookie year, he did not let it get to him. He kept going. He did not get demoralized. In his last season, he went 25 carries for 134 yards, 1 touchdown, 5 catches for 62 yards. So this dude got 200 all-purpose yards on his last day of his rookie year after having 3 or 4 miserable games because of how bad his offensive line is. But he did not let it get him down, and he stuck with it, and he's the GOAT running back. I don't care what anybody says. You're never going to convince me otherwise. Tout all the stats you want. Jim Brown was loaded with Hall of Famers on his team. Loaded. And the team was so good, they just brought in another guy. They just replaced him. They replaced Jim Brown, probably 80-90% as good as Jim Brown, at least in those first few years. And Barry Sanders is somewhere in the middle of Jim Brown and Walter Payton as far as having help. He had more help than Walter Payton did, but not near as much as Jim Brown. Absolutely. But like I said, you want to talk about being more exciting to watch, probably Barry Sanders. Jim Brown, probably second. He'd get in the open field, he'd just take off. He was the biggest guy on the field. The fastest, biggest guy. He was basically the Wilt Chamberlain of the NFL. But if you want to talk about doing all the duties of a running back, everything, there's nothing Walter Payton couldn't do on the football field. Nothing. He could do everything. And everything as a running back, he did great, and he's the greatest of all time. And to me, it's not really that close, but those are the 3 guys. It's Barry, it's Jim Brown, and it's Walter Payton. You pick the order. It's Walter all day for me. So anyway, that's all I got for this video. Thank you guys for watching. If you liked it, please hit the like button. If you wouldn't mind sharing it, that would be great. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. I give daily content. Usually it's NBA history, but I just couldn't wait to do this video because Walter, that's my guy. And that's it. Until next time.